area, as well as allowing for a public dialogue so that you can all ask your questions and explore whether New York State should have a public bank. And what would be the impact on New York State, the economic impact, and certainly the fiscal health of New York. And I'm Sandy Gale, a member of the New York State Assembly, so I'm particularly interested in the health of New York State, as you all are as state residents. So, and I want to thank the council for allowing this activity to take place here tonight, and for Westpac Foundation for hosting the event and lining up all the speakers. The background, and somebody said to me, well, how did you get into this whole issue of banking? And I'm not a banker. I've been a New York State Assemblywoman for 21 years. And prior to that, a county legislator, so I've been in government for a while. And prior to that, I was an educator. But I started to read about the whole issue of public banks, especially in the last, say, 6 years. And really started to focus in on, can we do something differently? Do we have to get into this economic bind that we were all in? Is there another approach? And we've also talked a lot about student loans and the lending process. We've actually changed some of our rules and regulations in New York State to help our students with banks. So, and I'd also had one of my constituents who probably will be here later, talk to me about setting up a bank to help people with their mortgages, and so on. So we decided, and Catherine McLaughlin is here, who's my legislative coordinator, we decided that we would offer a bill in Albany, which is Assembly Bill 1696, to talk about, if we can get this passed, to explore over a 2-year period, would this be a good thing for New York State? Should we have a state bank? And how should it be established? Should it be, part of our state government? Should it be an authority? We're recommending 15 commission members, appointed by the governor and the speaker and the majority leader. Is that the approach that one should use? And so tonight, I think, is one of the first opportunities, at least I've had. I know my panelists probably have had other opportunities to talk about public banks in New York State. But it's a wonderful opportunity for us to get this dialogue out to the people that are here, as well as those that are viewing this tape as we go forward. I have 3 wonderful panelists here, and each one of them is going to take probably about 20 minutes or a little bit less to talk about their feelings and the information that they have about where we should go. Just to backtrack just 1 second, North Dakota seems to be the only state that really has done this, and they did it in 1919, which is incredible. But there are a lot of other states, just like New York, that are kind of looking at this as an opportunity to go forward. So my first panelist is Scott Baker, and Scott is a New York State coordinator for the Public Banking Institute. He's president of the Common Ground New York City, a jurist group focused on achieving social justice and economic growth by untaxing productive activities and instead taxing vocational values and the use and abuse of natural resources. He also is the New York State coordinator for the Public Banking Institute, which seeks to promote public banking along the lines of the best-known American example, the Bank of North Dakota. Scott has appeared on TV and radio, written dozens of articles for the Huffington Post, Op-Ed News, and Groundswell, where he has promoted public banking, greenbacking, CAFRA reform, and the Jarlis, I don't know that I pronounced that right, George's single tax to both the public and to elected officials. Obviously, he's got training there. He has also taught at the Henry George School after completing 3 years, of course, in alternative economics. So we welcome Scott Baker, wonderful resume, and I know he's going to have some great slides for us to get a lot of information from. Scott, come up.
Okay, we have a lot to talk about tonight. I'm actually going to go backwards from the Assembly member because she's actually further advanced than a lot of people are and a lot of states are. So we're going to get some background material here before we get to that. So next slide, please. I'm going to have to say that a lot because you're too far away. We're going to have three parts in this slideshow. The budget problem, which all you legislators are going to recognize instantly, and why a bank can fix that, and how we can get that bank, or what can be done to get one. Next slide. All right, so here's your familiar problems. You've got, everybody has these three problems in every state: cutting spending, raising taxes, or selling off public assets. These are the only ways to balance the budget that most states know of right now. Next slide. Okay, now, there was, for a while, Obama went to Washington and he said that the Fed might have to help bail out municipalities and states. The Fed quickly put that notion to rest and said it is not their intention to do so, and actually that's a little bit of an understatement because legally they are not allowed to do so. So even though, next slide, even though their portion that they gave to the banks is this huge line, and this is all they would need to give to the states, a mere $191 billion as of 2011 when this slide show was made. That's something they can't do illegally. As a matter of fact, that's actually an understatement. They gave $16 trillion to the banks in either guarantees or actual reserve bill bolstering. And if you look at reports from Professor L. Randall Wray in the University of Missouri, and include the rotating loans, it's actually $29 trillion. So this is an enormous amount of money that the Fed has created out of thin air, but not for states or municipalities. Next slide. All right, so again, we have these three choices. And we're not going to get help from the Federal Reserve, so you can cut spending, raise taxes, sell off public assets. But now there's a new choice. So next slide. And next slide. Why a bank? All right. So now to create a bank, which North Dakota has done, would allow you to get your own credit. By creating a bank, you actually create credit for the state, and you can expand. It's like the inverse of the other list. You can expand the public services. You can lower the taxes. You can increase your bank's capital at any time to make it even better, make more credit available. And that way people of New York can have all of that credit. And we'll get into how that's going to happen a little bit later. All right, so no need for financial rescue. Okay, so we have the Bank of North Dakota, which is the best example we have and the only one in the country that was established in 1919. It's almost 100 years old. Now, North Dakota sailed through the crisis with a surplus and was the only state to do so. I know you're all going to say, well, it's the oil and gas, but consider that Alaska has twice the unemployment, has 7.1% unemployment. North Dakota, as of today, has 3.3%. And Alaska has oil and gas, of course, and about the same amount of people in it. So that doesn't quite explain it. And Montana is sort of a similar thing. They've got the Bakken Shale also. About the same population. They had a deficit as well. So there's more to it. So they also have some other things which is unique to the state. They have the lowest foreclosure rate, under 3%, the most banks per capita, no bank failures at all in 10 years. Now, if you think about that, there's actually been 300 bank failures just in a couple of years in the crisis. We had, I think, from 2008 to 2009, we had 296 bank failures nationwide, but none were in North Dakota. And that record continues. So they fund economic growth from Main Street, from tech endeavors to oil production to new energy as well. So you can see there. By the way, this whole slideshow is in the front table. So on your way out, if you hadn't picked one up already, you can get the whole thing. Next slide. All right, so now here's how it works. Now here's what we have currently. The taxpayer, poor taxpayer, puts everything into state government. They make, they expend some of it, so you've got your state expenses. And while they're waiting to spend it, they invest it into a Wall Street bank typically, or a big bank, which may be on Wall Street. And what does the Wall Street bank do? Well, they put it in the stock market, and we know how stable that is. They put it into currency speculation. By the way, I went through the New York State pension fund. There's 56 currencies in that pension fund, which means they're investing in 56 countries that are not New York State, which is not a country, but still. And they put it into derivatives, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But that's probably the most unstable and risky investment of all three of these. Then they get profits, not the state, but the bank. and they get a little modest return because interest rates are so low. That's about all they're going to get. Now contrast that to the state bank system. Again, taxpayer puts money in state government. Now that government puts it into a state bank, and actually there's a step missing here. The state bank actually backstops, at least on the model of North Dakota, they backstop all the local community banks, and they allow those banks to invest in the state needs, housing, mortgages, factories, oil development in North Dakota, of course, that's a big deal. Businesses, trucking, whatever. And then these state projects create jobs, and that helps support the taxpayer. So they can have a nice synergy that goes round and round. So you can lower the taxes because we've created these jobs out of the state bank and this whole thing. Next slide. All right, so now here's some actual practical examples of this. Now this is the loan per capita, and you can see some comparable states, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and the U.S. way down here on the bottom. So loans per capita in North Dakota is steadily going up. A couple of hiccups there in the crisis, but basically going up. The other three states are kind of trailing off, and actually it's gotten worse since then. And the whole United States is down here, 3,000 per person per loan. Next slide. All right, now here's how that happens. The little banks, the small and the medium banks in North Dakota, they actually have these 75% loan to asset ratio. And then you look at these other states, they don't have nearly that much. So what's happening here is that you have these other states, they can't make those kind of loan to asset ratio loans because they don't have a state bank behind them. So even though they might like to make more loans, they're just not capable of doing it. Now just for contrasting that, I pulled this out the other day, and this isn't even on the handout, but New York's J.P. Morgan has a 31% loan to asset ratio, meaning that they make money the old-fashioned way through derivatives and the trading desk and everything except making loans. This is one of the huge banks and one of the big six that has 80% of all the deposits in the country at this point. All right, so next slide, good. Okay, so why a bank? Well, the Bank of North Dakota has had 20% return on equity. Now let's be generous. Okay, let's say that oil and gas is a big part of this. So cut it in half. But even so, if you again compare this to the New York State Pension Fund, that's at about a 6.5% return, basically in the last 10 years. So in 10 years, they've had 20%, and a comparable fund, we'll see why it's comparable later, has had maybe 6.5%, and it's been very volatile. So the Bank of North Dakota has returned $300 million over 10 years, return, not taken, which went into the state treasury directly, reducing the tax burden and supporting public services. In contrast, of course, if the state has to take out a bond issuance, it has to pay interest, perhaps 5-6% interest, depending on the state's rating at the time. So, there's a complete difference there. The bank is supporting the state, it's providing dividends, and in contrast, when you have to borrow from the bank, when the state has to borrow, they have to pay interest on that borrowing. So why are our tax dollars supporting Wall Street? Why not invest in state and support education, higher education, renewable energy, tech startups, and so forth? Okay. Now, just to go back to that pension fund just for a minute here, the pension fund of New York State was at $156 billion in 2007. Then we had the crash. It went down to $110 billion. Now that's, to me, it doesn't sound like a very stable return on funds or use of that fund. So it's kind of crawled back now. It took about 4 years to do it. It's about back where it started. But of course, if you're a legislator and you're seeing this collapse, it's a reason to panic, because how are you going to pay the people who are taking the money out? Now, according to DiNapoli's report, that amount in the last 10 years has gone from $4.5 billion to $8.9 billion. That's how much is withdrawn. So you're not going to get there by laying people off. Even if you laid off everybody, first of all, they're already retired people who are taking this, so it's not going to do any good in that year. And second, it's just not enough. If you have a $40 billion loss, you can't get there when people are only taking out less than $9 billion. So you have to do something with the investment side of it. So this is what North Dakota has done. So they invested in their own citizens. Next slide. And, all right, they freed up the funds. They created their own credit, and I should also back up. There's other funds besides pension funds. There's rainy day funds. And Ellen Brown, who's the president and chair of the Public Banking Institute, where I volunteer, she came up with a $71 billion fund in California, which was a rainy day fund, and it was in the Treasury's office. And she asked him, well, why can't you use this for the state? It's only got a $26 billion deficit, so you could cover that. But they can't. And legally they can't. And if you look at these comprehensive annual financial reports, or CAFR for short, you'll see that there are these funds all over. In fact, there's close to 200,000 of these funds. If you really go the whole country, and you look at all the municipalities, all the little firemen's funds and all of these things. So if you add it all together, it's tens of trillions of dollars. And all we're asking for is a part of that to be put into a public bank. I mean, this is one way. Now, the Bank of North Dakota did it by raising money through a bond. But now we have these other funds, and so why put the state into further debt when we already have this option? Next slide. All right, now again, going back to the state and what it has to do when it borrows. Now, a bank can borrow at a very low rate at this point because the Fed has slashed rates to practically zero, so they can borrow at 0.2%. And even, a 6-month CD is 1.27%. But going back to California, they're paying 9% now because they've got a BBB rating, which is pretty low. It's about the level of Greece. And so they have to pay a lot when they borrow money. New York is better off. We've got an AA rating. But still, I'd be surprised if you're paying less than 4% on any money that you borrow in a bond. Next slide. All right. So yeah, there's the rating on the bottom. You can see for New York, A plus to AA minus as of 2013. But many states are worse off, but even so, we could be doing better. The next slide. Okay, so again, the state can borrow, but can they borrow affordably? So it's not just a matter of getting credit, it's a matter of affordable credit. Now, if you can create your own credit through a state bank, you don't have to borrow. Next slide. What can be done? Next slide. All right, today state and local governments are investing their capital pension fund and depositing them in Wall Street. So we're handing over this credit ability to Wall Street, which are the people, of course, who created the crash. And we'll probably do the next crash as well in a few years. So why are we doing that? Why don't we invest in Main Street through a state bank? Next slide. Okay, so all right, so the deposits begin the creation of credit in the bank, and the biggest deposit of all is the taxes that come in. This is what North Dakota does legally. They take all the tax money, and by law, it all goes first into this bank, and then as the year goes on, they start spending it out, and then they collect more, and it keeps on going. So they have a pretty consistent revenue stream, and they don't even have to be guaranteed by the FDIC. It's the state itself that guarantees it. So they're saving a fee on that side. And they really have a stable source of money, and it's fairly predictable, as you know. Okay, next slide. So this keeps our tax money working in the state. It keeps the credit from leaving the state, and we're going to see a little more about how that happens. And it strengthens the community banks, and this is really important because North Dakota, again, has the highest per capita bank ratio in the country. They have 94 banks, little banks, in North Dakota. When they need to make a loan, they can go to the Bank of North Dakota and acts as a mini Fed, and they can say, well, backstop in our loan, and then they can do that high loan to asset ratio. So this is something anybody, this is a completely nonpartisan issue. If you're progressive, if you're conservative, there's something here that, you've got your state's rights. This should appeal to everybody who wants to keep money in the state, who wants to keep the state going. It should appeal to progressives because you're creating jobs in the state, you're creating good green jobs. And you have the opportunity to do all these things with state banking. Okay, next slide. All right. So again, we have these four choices, these four terrible choices: to raise taxes, cut services, sell assets, or the good choice, invest in our own citizens by creating a public bank. Now, as far as states go, there's no other choices. There are choices if you're the federal government. You can coin money, as it says in Article 1, Section 8. We can't do that. But being a state, you have to balance your budget every year, so those are really your choices. Next slide. Okay, so now we need to pass a resolution so that we can get a state bank here. Now how do we do that? We have to get some natural allies. Next slide. So the natural allies are community leaders, and there are probably some in this room, enlightened legislators, I know there's one in this room, the public employees and the unions faced with city and state budget cuts, teachers, firefighters, anybody who's going to lose a job or perhaps lose their pension should be interested in this. These are our natural allies. Unemployed and underemployed people, well, they're going to want more jobs, so this is the way of creating it. Next slide. All right, now just so you, in case you forgot, this came out of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and it shows the total derivative exposure of the big banks in this country. Now you got to add 6 zeros. So this is 69 trillion, not 69 million. That's their exposure as of July 30th, 2012. And this is J.P. Morgan with 1.8 trillion in assets with a $69 trillion exposure. Now I know it's nominal, and I know they hedge, and of course they would never mishedge because they wouldn't have a London whale or anything, right? But nevertheless, they have these swaps, and they have a bunch of other things which, if they default, are going to cost them big money. And it doesn't take a lot, because you can see if it's a $1.8 trillion bank and they've got that much exposure, even 5% is going to wipe out the entire bank. So they don't have to fail by a lot, just a little. And that's it. So that's the end. So now let's make it happen. I told you I could do it.
Thank you, Scott, very much. It was a wonderful presentation. Easy to get it done, just like that, right? I'd just like to introduce Shelley Mayer, who's an assemblywoman who's just come in the back of the room. So you have two members of the assembly here tonight. Is there anybody else that's in government that's here? Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Alex Rittner. I'm community liaison for Assemblyman David Buchwald, who, unfortunately, well, due to his session errors at a town board meeting, was unable to make here, but I'm more than happy to be learning about this. Thank you.
Right, great.
And then one more here. Dan Welsh, Analyst Borough Town Council.
Terrific. All right, and everybody else is involved in different ways. Now I'd like to ask Felice Gelman if she would come up. She's the co-founder, was the co-founder in 1997 of Sunova Capital, which became the largest hedge fund dedicated to investing in banks and financial stocks, managing over $1 billion. She is currently a certified financial analyst and a past president of the New York Bank and Financial Analyst Society. Welcome, Felice.
Thanks. Scary to hear that word hedge fund when you're talking derivatives and stuff. But I guess I could say I've been following the banking industry since 1982, so sort of seen it all. And it's all right there. Just let me start. I'm going to just try to talk about some fairly basic things. A bank is basically where money is deposited, and then it's either invested in loans, bonds, stocks, or derivatives, really benefit the depositors. And I don't know, I don't know how much benefit any of you depositors feel you're getting out of the money that you put in your checking account other than being able to withdraw it. So that's sort of where we're going. A public bank also has to earn a profit in order to stay in existence, but it can direct its opportunities, it can direct itself towards opportunities that have a social purpose, which does not mean giving money away. It means investing for the public good. So I'm going to try to explain to you why it's really not possible for commercial banks to do this, even if they're run by people who were benevolent in their efforts. Here, it's really not a negligible matter. Just take a look at this. I was kind of surprised, actually, when I put together this chart. Deregulation of commercial banks began in the early 1980s, and since then, the commercial banks have suffered one crisis after another. The first was LDC lending, when all of the U.S. banks, and I mean vast numbers of U.S. banks, banks you would never have expected to do this lend money to Latin America at a massive at a massive amount. Then there was followed by the Texas real estate crisis, which was both energy and real estate, and ended up spreading across the country in a real estate crisis, and half the savings and loan industry went out of business as a result of that. Then we had that savings and loan crisis. We had an Asian financial crisis and Russian default. Again, the U.S. banks were ever too happy to participate in making loans and losing money there. We had the internet bubble, we had the Enron fraud, also big lending opportunities. And then finally, the biggest lending opportunity of all, subprime housing, which created the collapse and recession that we had. And you would have thought by then the banks would have been a little bit chastened, but no, they immediately bought the securities of European banks, which are now defaulting and in crisis. So to my surprise, in the 40 years that this little thing covers, there are only 10 years when banks were not in crisis, when the U.S. banks were not in some form of crisis or another. And this has made them an extremely weak reed to lean on if you are looking for economic development or even fair lending policies. Why? Because each of these crises destroyed vast amounts of bank capital. Vast amounts of bank capital. And that's very important because banks are, I would describe them as highly leveraged institutions. Every dollar of capital supports between $10 and $20 of loans at a minimum. So when you destroy a dollar of capital, you just cut out $20 worth of loans. So when a bank is, its capital is what cushions it from losses. And when it loses more than 5 or 10% of the loans that it makes, when those are losses, bank is bankrupt. So you have to make 95% of your lending decisions have to be good ones. It should be 99% if you're a well-run bank. So that's a pretty hard record to maintain if you're trying to maximize your return and earn as much money as you possibly can. So you're pretty vulnerable to the guy who comes along and says, got a great real estate development here, just lend me the money, and I'm putting 3% down myself, you give me 97%, and we're going to make a lot of money together. The banks have, that's pretty much how the banks have been making loans lately. So at that point, the banks that are too big to fail when they have these, when they have not made 95% of their decisions correctly, those banks are kept alive by taxpayers' subsidies. So it's, when we're talking about public banking, we're not just talking about putting your taxpayer money to work in a way that benefits you. We might be talking about not putting your taxpayer money to work to support problem banks. So the banks have really tried to rebuild their capital over this period of 40 years in 3 ways. First one, which is the hidden one, and maybe not so apparent to all of you, is government subsidies. And I don't mean just the bailout money that Scott was talking about, which is huge, but the biggest government subsidy is low interest rates. The interest rates are kept purposefully low by the government, so as a depositor, you are not making the money that you should be making on your deposits. And the idea is that the banks can continue to offer credit cards at 19%, but they're paying you 0.5% instead of 5, 6, 8% that you might have gotten in the past. So that's one of the big ways. The second thing is they overcharge the customer, and actually I've had bank executives admit to me that they are overcharging the customers, and they know they're doing it, but they can't figure out how to stay on the earnings growth wagon and not overcharge. And the final way is to take more risk in lending and investing, and particularly taking risk in investing. So it's really not so surprising that no matter what government says about we're trying to encourage banks to make more loans to business, and that's the reason we're doing all of this and so forth, the banks are not doing this. And customers and small consumers and small businesses are not getting the credit they need, and they're not getting it at a reasonable price. And so, as Scott was saying, the public bank, which has a predictable, low-cost source of funding, can make longer-term loans with much less risk than commercial banks. It's not trying to rebuild its capital. It's not trying to recover from the last speculation. and it can be run on a very sound basis. The majority of funds that commercial banks lend are short-term funds. When you put your money in your checking account, you can withdraw it any day you want. And even you can break your CDs if you're willing to sacrifice the interest you've earned. And guess what? When a commercial bank's loans appear to be risky, people get worried, they go to the bank and they take their money out. That's a run on the bank. And the most immediate example of this is what we're seeing in the euro crisis right now. So people are trying to get their money out of the banks because the banks have been overextended. The governments are bailing out the banks because they are afraid that the whole system will collapse. And the way they're doing that is they are confiscating people's deposits. So that's kind of how the commercial banking system works. In crisis, it really is not. It cannot serve a public purpose. It cannot serve the purpose of economic development because of these crises, and they're very, very difficult for commercial banks to avoid. And I could describe to you why, but it's pretty straightforward, which is that banks try to earn the highest possible rate of return they can. And in most countries, this means real estate speculation, just as we've seen in our country. When the prices stop spiraling up, the depositors say there are going to be big losses. They think their deposits are at risk. Everybody tries to get their money, and the government has to step in. So what's the point about all of this? And really, what does it have to do with public banking? Public bank does not have this kind of liquidity risk. It does not have people saying, I see that you've been making condominium development loans, and so I'm worried you're going to fail and I want my money back. The state deposits its tax receipts. There's this predictable source of funding. And if the bank makes a bad loan, if they make a bad decision, they have the time, because nobody is coming and asking for the money that they lent back. No depositors are lining up at the door. They have the time to work out this problem over time. So it's a much safer banking system than the commercial banking system. So, for example, probably any of you who own homes, if you looked at the value of your home in 2008 or 2009, it was pretty alarming, and much less than it had been in 2004. But over time, that value is coming back. The banks were forced to recognize all the losses, the commercial banks. They were forced to recognize the losses on those mortgage loans. A public bank, which has not to worry about its funding, has a much longer period of time to work out that loan. If the economy is going to recover, the value of the loan is going to recover, they don't have to recognize those losses. The taxpayers don't have to bear those losses. So that's I think, another important point about a public bank and the kinds of loans that it can make and so forth. It can't make high-risk loans, but it can recover from its mistakes in a much more orderly fashion. And then finally, just to put that in perspective, at the peak of the financial crisis, which is 2009, just looking at the larger banks, and that's the ones that are bigger than $3 billion in assets, they reported serious problem loans of 4.3% of their assets, or more than half their capital. So the whole banking system was in pretty dire shape. And the government stepped in 3 ways, really. They provided those capital injections that Scott talked about. That was your money. They the bank examiners allowed the banks to not recognize their problems, which is usually the word that they use is called forbearance. And what that means in a crisis like this is that weak borrowers receive preference over strong borrowers, and that makes the economy contract. If you have a growing business and you go to a bank that has problems and ask them for credit, they say, no, we can't give you credit because we're dealing with our problem loans and we're not able to extend credit to you. And then finally, they require banks to raise additional capital. And again, that means that banks don't want to make loans, so credit is not available. So none of these things that have come out of the commercial banks are good consequences for the population or for most businesses. And none of them, obviously, are things that would happen, should happen with public banks. We know that, can I have the next slide? I think I have another slide here. Yeah. Right, okay, I talked about that. Can I have one more? There we go. So what do we need in order to have a public bank? It's because a public bank is not magic, I will tell you. It's not a magic. It has to be structured properly. It has to have the proper public purpose. It has to be well capitalized. It has to have a steady, predictable source of funding. It has to have professional management, and it has to have a compensation system for that professional management, which is not the Wall Street form of compensation. That's very doable. I can tell you there are thousands of very competent bankers around the country. Some of them are unemployed because their banks have laid them off, and some of them are just interested in running a good bank. It's not a problem. And they need to have a well-defined social purpose. Just to give you an example of what I mean, the U.S. did have a public bank, besides the Bank of North Dakota, not that long ago. And that came about when the Continental Illinois Bank, which was the 7th largest bank in the United States, failed. That was in 1984. It failed as a result of having made bad energy loans, and the government took it over. They tried to sell it, but nobody would take it. So they took it over, and they owned this bank for 7 years. So it was a public bank. It had no public purpose, however. The government's aim was just to try to prevent a run on this bank, which would have triggered a massive financial crisis, and then to sell it as quickly as possible. So they sold it to the Bank of America. It did not do anything to expand credit, and the government did not use, they funded it with money from the Treasury to keep it from failing, but it did not use it as a depository for their government receipts. And on the other side of this, the equation, which would be the asset side of the equation, and something that does have a public purpose, New York State has an economic development bank of sorts. It's not a bank exactly. It's called the Empire State Development Corporation. But rather than utilizing government receipts and taxes, it issues bonds, which are either backed by project revenues or by taxpayer receipts. And it uses those bonds to raise funds for real estate and business development projects. So what that means is that rather than capturing the tax receipts and the financial processing revenues that come from those tax receipts and using those to issue interest-paying loans, instead New York State pays to sell bonds to then subsidize development projects and businesses in order to develop jobs. I would say that the Empire State Development Corporation, I think, is generally regarded as not having been particularly successful. It's been historically very opaque. It has little accountability. And Governor Cuomo has announced that he would like to reorganize the Empire State Development Corporation, saying that it's outdated, ineffective, and disorganized, which I would say are kind words compared to what it actually is. But this might be exactly the time to then talk about the possibility of a public bank to take over some of the functions of the Empire State Development Bank, because we have an economic development policy. It needs to be reorganized, and this is maybe an appropriate way to do it. Certainly a time to discuss this.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, once we have the last panelist, then we'll have all your questions. Mark Viscon is the Senior Policy Strategist at the Center for Working Families, a nonprofit think and do tank. That's what we call it, right?
Yes.
Think and do tank that works with elected leaders, grassroots groups, and labor unions to enact innovative policies for New York State. And at the center, he's worked on a range of issues, including fair taxation, campaign finance reform, which is another hot topic, economic inequity, and he has a PhD in sociology from New York University, prior to which he was a research analyst at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition and the National Low Income Housing Coalition, two organizations dedicated to promoting progressive federal housing policy. Welcome, Mark.
So thank you everyone for coming tonight. I want to thank Member Gaelic for moderating, as well as Captain McLaughlin and Wes Pat for just participating. So I will speak closer to this. Okay. I went with the minimalist design for this, just so you know. You can even move forward from it, actually. So one of the Center for Working Families, one of the reasons we're actually involved in a state bank is, as Member Gaelic mentioned, that we're interested in both thinking and doing. And what that actually means is we actually try to come up with good, progressive and interesting policy ideas for creating, effective policy. And interestingly enough, Felice Feldman's daughter, Mia Feldman, used to work at the center and was deeply involved in one of our, I think, bigger successes with the Green Jobs Green New York program for energy efficient retrofits. Move it away? Okay. So in any event, we've actually institutionally been working on a white paper for off and on for probably about 2 years now, and we're hoping to actually put it out very quickly, but at the moment we're very knee-deep in campaign finance reform work. So we're still hoping to put out a white paper definitely this year, hopefully within a month or two, basically talking about this. And what I would like to actually do right now is kind of focus a little bit more on the New York State, get into some of the specifics about what's going on in New York State in particular. Both dealing with the state's current investment and economic development programs, a little bit more in detail. I want to mention ESD, or ESDC as it's sometimes known. And also how a state bank could improve things, and I think also maybe open up a discussion, I think that would be actually really good for moving to the Q&A about kind of the nuts and bolts. Like, what do we have to think about to make a state bank successful? And this is the kind of thing that, as you've probably seen, like financial programs and systems can go really haywire very easily. So if we're interested in actually working on a state bank and putting something forward, we have to think very carefully about how exactly that's done, and as it goes through the legislative process as well. So that's, I think, something that's really important to kind of deal with. So I think one of the central benefits we actually see is, and has been mentioned as a benefit of the state bank, is the potential to redirect the state's money from Wall Street to Main Street. Currently, a lot of state monies, again, are being parked in Wall Street banks that pay minimum rates of return and take advantages of state and state agencies quite often. I mean, obviously we've seen the decrease in lending. A lot of this has been focused on home lending, but also small business lending in general is something that's actually imploded a lot over the last few years. And also, things like interest rate swaps, where basically states, in order to pay bonds, basically make an agreement to pay a certain rate of interest rate and swap that with the variable interest rate. And what happens in a financial crisis is the state ends up paying high interest rates and only gets back very low interest rates. And New York State, as of last year, was paying, I think, $250 million just to try to get out of some of these things. So this is the kind of thing that state governments and local governments too get trapped in this kind of thing. So that's one of the things we want to get into. So again, to get into this a little bit more in detail, a state bank, as it has happened in North Dakota, can mitigate kind of the impact of recession, because it has something called patient capital, which is just, as has been mentioned, I mean, the bank doesn't necessarily need the rate of return instantly. It's not strictly beholden to shareholders. So what can happen during a financial crisis or just a recession is a state bank can actually keep lending going. What's happened in, this is New York State data, is you see a big bubble, obviously, this is small business data. You see the bubble in 2006, 2007, and then basically credit imploded. And what a state bank can do, and has been actually shown in North Dakota with some research, is that it's able to level that out a little bit. I mean, we see in 2011 lending's going up a little bit, but we're still talking significantly below 2005 levels. So that's one of those things where a state bank can actually help out with. In general, small businesses are actually having a big problem finding loans. A Federal Reserve Bank of New York study that just came out last August, they're doing another one right now, said about 30% of survey firms didn't even apply for credit because they just figured it wasn't even worth the problem. It wasn't even worth the chance. And then also only 13% of businesses actually applying got everything they were looking for. So another 36% received partial funding. So basically, even when it's very difficult, if anyone's ever looked into this stuff, it's very difficult to measure demand for small business lending in a lot of ways, but everything that's actually out there has shown that it's very difficult for businesses to actually get loans. And this is a problem, because businesses are actually what's actually creating the jobs, and by not getting loans, they can't expand or build the economy. Also, and this is, I think, another important thing that also plays into how a state bank would actually be organized, but a state bank could also really help small community banks out. And we have to talk about what we actually mean by community banks and how we define that, because it's very difficult to figure out exactly what a good community bank is. So, in general, the one thing that small banks do is they know their neighborhoods. I don't know how many of you are members of, say, credit unions or small banks, or, depending on what you do, but you have a different level of, relationship with a small bank. We're talking back to It's a Wonderful Life. Like that kind of model of a community bank is hard to find. I mean, I live, in New York City, where they're kind of thin on the ground specifically, but there is this idea where the advantage with the small bank is they actually know the community. So if someone's coming to you for a loan, you know what the business is, if it's been around for 20 or 30 years, or this kind of thing. And what's happening with a lot of small banks, especially with some of the regulations that have happened during the financial crisis, is they're hitting small banks in particularly difficultly too, because regulators, when we've had discussions with small bankers, come in and said, like, you can't make this loan. And the small banker says, we've been doing this for years. Yes?
I'm very interested in what you're saying, but I'm having such a hard time hearing you. I don't know why.
Okay.
Maybe went a little bit slower.
A little bit closer?
Slower.
And slower? Okay. This is what happens when I try speaking through things.
Sorry.
No, it's
in your hands.
It's fine. So I apologize. So that's the other thing, basically. Banks can be the idea of a public bank is to be a participation lender. We're not actually talking about a bank that's making direct loans, generally. I mean, once in a while, North Dakota has done some direct loans if there's no other private banks are actually interested. But basically what it does is a public bank will help put up some of the money for a loan and basically partner with a local bank. So basically this is a way of getting money back flowing into local communities and the banks that actually, make these things. And this is sort of this idea also, we talked about patient capital, but I think a really also a good way to look at this is a state bank not only has kind of the market portfolio and the market-driven element, which is what all banks do, like they have to make money, which is part of it. And then participation lending is this market side of it. Basically the bank makes a loan, they expect to get money back, and they can plow that back into the bank profits as well as making more loans. I mean, this is the old model of how banks should work. But you can also have a mission-driven portfolio as well and actually focus on other aspects. And our organization, Center for Working Families, has been interested in things like green jobs, also making good jobs available, things like higher education loans, which North Dakota State Bank has actually been very involved in actually creating, getting their higher education loan system kind of up and running, and things like business and farm startup initiatives. So basically some conversations that we've had with lenders have shown a strong need to further develop, especially some new small business education. So a lot of lenders have actually said small businesses need this kind of work too. So a state bank can also possibly think about ways to kind of bring in some of these programs. But there's a whole bunch. We've also talked, I don't think we actually came up with it today, but things like disaster relief and disaster financing of, after natural disaster. North Dakota's bank has been very involved in this, for instance. Things like credit access for farms, companies, manufacturers, all these kinds of things. I think when we're thinking about what a state bank can do that current banks are not, is the kind of thing we should get into. So if you can move to this is actually something that's going to be a quiz it later. This is basically showing kind of the morass of current existing programs for state banks. So we've got a small business in green at the right, and we don't have to go through all the details, but as Lisa mentioned, ESD, which is actually also known as ESDC, and I think is technically the Urban Redevelopment Corporation is the official name. It gets a new name every 3 years. This is one of the programs. So they involve in programs like the Small Business Revolving Loan Fund, there's a Community Bank Deposit Program, and all these kind of programs do sort of exist, but they're all over the place. So this actually simplifies things a fair amount, but it's basically showing just how complicated things are, and you don't actually have to know this. And again, how many of you have heard of the idea of like an infrastructure bank?
What's that?
An infrastructure bank? Okay, so this is something that actually is not the same thing. Infrastructure banks have been in the news somewhat. Como's promoted the New York Works Infrastructure Bank, and I think there's a green bank that he did in the previous one. And they're not the same thing. I mean, an infrastructure bank or a green bank is generally sort of a pool of money And the idea behind that is basically you have a whole bunch of money in all these different places, and if you centralize it, you can